say that? It's not my
Wild business. Nee, maar ook van Rising.
Okay, good evening everyone. We're going to start because Jeff has a lot to tell us. So I want to make use of this evening. Welcome, my name is Arella Graziani. I'm one of the founders of the organization Gate 48, platform for critical Israelis in the Netherlands. And this evening is obviously, as you know, about Jeff Halper's new book, this book. But before we start, I want to tell you that we are organizing this event, so it's Gate 48 together with DocP. You can find the whole description there and Gate 48 here. With FIP, who will say some words about their own organization in a minute, and SRP, Studenten voor Rechtvaardigheid Palestina. So I'm just giving FIP a few words to explain what they are doing, and you also have their flyers on your seats, I think.
Yeah, so good evening everybody. I'm here as a member of the FIP board. We're an educational network for human rights in Israel and Palestine, and we organize an internship every year in July and August. On your seat you found a postcard and a flyer, so I will not tell you a lot because there's a lot on this card and this flyer. If you have questions afterwards, please come to us. I did my internship at Jeff, so that's why I'm standing here. It was a really inspiring 5 weeks. And, well, if you have questions, come to us afterwards and have a nice evening.
Thank you. Very happy always to work with groups of students. Jeff Halper, probably most of you know his work. He's actually an anthropologist in a core, and I'm also an anthropologist, so great connection here. But as he always says, he turned away from academia a long time ago to become a full-time activist, and he has been so for many, many years, living in Jerusalem, most of all with ICAD, the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. Doing very important work, but today we're here to celebrate this new book, War Against the People, Israel, the Palestinians, and Global Pacification. And of course he will elaborate much more about what the book is about, but basically Jeff's questions and wants to uncover in detail how what he calls pacification industry, which is global, but with Israel as a major force, how this works. And he takes us from Israeli arms, the arms industry, to military technologies, in a quest to answer an important question with which he also begins the book, and that is, how does Israel get away with it? And he will tell us more about these questions and hopefully also about his answer for it. Before I give the floor to Jeff, just a few comments. As you see, there's a lot of information here. First of all, there's a lot of books. Of course, Jeff's book, which is sold by the American Book Center. Great to have you here. It's $24.99. And then we also have this little book. Je bent er geweest. You're very welcome to have a look at it. It's with poems, little poems, can we say, and drawings. By Len Munich, and it costs €10, and money goes to the YMCA, a project for ex-detained children, Palestinian children, right?
Yeah, in Palestine.
In Palestine. And there's a report about of the coalition not a coalition anyway, a report about Palestinian children in military detention. So anyway, there's a lot of other books as well. If you want to buy Jeff's book, he's also ready after the talk to sign it, which of course is a great opportunity. And lastly, but not least, if you want to donate some money for ICAD, for the organization Jeff is working very hard on in Jerusalem, very important work, this bag will serve as a hat. So anything you want to donate, you can just put in the bag, and then Jeff will take it with him to Jerusalem, and I'm sure it will go across. So Jeff, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you all.
As usual, I know half the audience, so I don't have to feel very intimidated. Thanks to Irela, thanks to the organizers, and I have to tell you, Lynn and I were in college together in Minnesota 50 years ago. So there's all kinds of circles. We both found our different Palestinians. And Lynn, yeah, I know. It's an old story. And okay, I promise I try to do this in an hour. I promise Irela either an hour or when I see that people are getting bored, I'll stop. So we'll see what comes first. So I'm Jeff Halper, and I'm the head of the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, which is an Israeli political organization that's dedicated to ending the occupation and achieving a just peace, whatever that means these days. We're thinking about, I was here in a debate a couple of weeks ago about the one-state solution that I'm trying to begin to talk about. But over the years, we've been very active in terms of resisting the occupation. And I'm an anthropologist, and I have to say that I couldn't do my work without anthropology. Put a little PR for anthropology. Because the ability to go from the micro to the macro, to look at what's happening and to read what's happening on the ground, and then to say, well, what does this mean? I tell you, I don't want to waste time with this too much, but I think the basic question of anthropology is the basic question of life. And that is, what in the hell is going on here? And the hell part is really important. That's the critical part. Journalists and all kinds of people go in, and politicians, and say, what's going on here? And they get this story and that story, and they go home. But what the hell is going on? Where you really begin to listen to the people, and you read between the lines, and you try to look at things critically, a whole different kind of an analysis of a story comes out. And anthropology really has helped me to bridge that, being an activist on the ground. And there's a lot of activists on the ground, but they don't always know what they're seeing, what they're experiencing. And then there's a lot of academics, of course, that write and read and so on, but they're not on the ground. So their stuff tends to be a little bit theoretical and abstract. And anthropology really pulls it together. So I should say, as long as Irela mentioned anthropology, I'll give a plug to anthropology as well. And in fact, I got to this book, War Against the People, by thinking anthropologically. I mean, I'm looking down at the occupation all the time. And, house demolitions, expropriation of land, I mean, everything, the settlements, the walls, the whole terrible thing of this occupation, the brutality and so on. And in the back of my mind over the years is this question, how does Israel get away with it? And it wasn't always a conscious question, but and the usual reasons didn't satisfy me. The Jewish lobby. Well, the AIPAC has a certain clout in the US and so on, but there's a lot of countries that are today pro-Israel, like India, for example, that doesn't have a Jewish community. Christian fundamentalists. Okay, they have a role to play in the Republican Party in the US, in Holland to some degree. The Christian International Embassy in Jerusalem is run traditionally by Dutch people. But that doesn't really play a role in most countries, Christian Zionists. Guilt over the Holocaust might have a certain impact. It does on policy in Germany, and maybe Poland to a certain degree, but it doesn't really affect the United States. The United States doesn't even know there was a Holocaust. It happened more than 5 years ago, so it's kind of been forgotten. So none of those reasons really, that you always hear, really, never really did it. So I began to think about it. What is the reason? And the saying of Kissinger kind of stuck in my mind. Kissinger used to say, countries don't have friends. They have interests. So I began to search for what's the interest here? What's the quid pro quo? What can explain with all the brutality of the occupation, violations of human rights, violations of international law, defiance of dozens of UN resolutions, everything, how do you explain the support that Israel gets in the international community? Maybe less so today from the people on the ground. I think people are starting to get it. But certainly from governments, including your government. What's going on here? What's the source of that clout? Or the source of this kind of uncritical support that Israel gets? I was looking for the reason, the elephant in the room that we're not talking about. And more, of course, my attention was drawn to the whole issue of, I'm saying, well, what is Israel really doing here in the occupied territory? And I've always been looking down at what Israel's doing. House demolitions and the wall and settlements and land expropriation and arrests. I said, what would happen if I looked up at Israel's place in the world? I mean, Israel's obviously has a very successful foreign policy, Hasbara, right? The PR of Israel and so on. It's persuading somebody, at least in governments. What if I looked up? And when you look up, all of a sudden a whole different picture of Israel begins to emerge. Wow, this little tiny country that's always complaining about how small it is and how it's in a tough neighborhood and this little Jewish boy in the ghetto, that's getting beaten up all the time. All of a sudden you begin to discover the ties that Israel has in terms of military, security, and policing with the elites of the world. And it really came home to me, I think, last summer, as I was writing the book, the assault on Gaza, the summer of 2014, where the attack on Gaza was so disproportionate in a military sense. It had nothing to do with the actual threat that these Hamas rockets posed to Israel. There was no way you could justify militarily that kind of attack. Something else was going on. And I think that something else is the fact that Israel uses the occupied territories as a resource, as a laboratory for testing and developing weapons that it then exports. In a sense, Israel exports the occupation. That makes sense to some degree, and I could have left it at that. But in fact, all right, Israel's very clever with high tech. It's developed weapons over 100 years of fighting Palestinians. It has an occupation, so it's been able to test on kind of a captive population, all kinds of technologies of surveillance and security and so on. But still, there's a lot of other countries in the world that also export arms and so on. Israel seems to have a disproportionate role even in the international arms trade. It depends how you measure, what you count. But Israel itself claims to be the number 3 arms supplier in the world. Nobody's going to ever catch up with the United States. They win, hands down. And number 2 is Russia. But number 3 is Israel vying with France. Israel sells more arms than China or Britain. And what makes it even more impressive is that they're not big arms. In other words, if you sold ships and jet airplanes and tanks and so on, okay, those are expensive toys, and you make a lot of money. But Israel doesn't produce those things. It produces components of weapon systems, pieces, systems. In other words, to be the number 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, it doesn't matter, arms supplier in the world, where you're really selling components of weapon systems, means that your penetration into armies, foreign armies and security services, is much deeper than if you're just selling this big military hardware. So I began to look at the role that Israel plays then. How can you explain that role that Israel has? It isn't just another country in the arms trade, but it's really carved out a very dominant position in many ways. How can you explain that? And I began to, first of all, investigate the nature of war today. And one of the reasons I wrote this book was because I don't know anything about the military. I mean, I wrote a book I know nothing about something I know nothing about, which is interesting. I don't know if that recommends the book or not to you. But, you know, I'm an activist. I mean, I wrote this as an activist, not as an academic. And I'm trying to be involved with the Palestine issue and other issues, you know, global issues and so on. And I don't know anything about the military or the technologies of the military. And I know less about security systems and policing. This seemed to me a huge blind spot, not only for me, but for the left in general. It's not on this, all this stuff is not on the map of the left. We don't know this, we don't demonstrate about it. Little pieces we've caught on to. Drones. Drones have become kind of a popular subject today. But that's a tiny little piece of this. You know, the military security industry is a $2.5 trillion a year industry. I mean, that's got to have tremendous impact on societies, especially when we take into consideration that many of the largest arms buyers are the poorest countries. And they're countries that our countries in the global north peddle their arms to in all kinds of ways. It's got to distort societies, economies, politics, obviously. And yet it's a subject that we don't really know very much about. And I didn't know much about it. So part of the reason I wanted to write this book was to begin to get some of this stuff out. And I want to tell you, I'll mention a little bit tonight, the middle of the book is boring. It's almost like a catalog. Because I want us to sort of understand what those weapon systems are. And as an anthropologist, you know, we like to use the language of our informants. So I try to use the language of the military. How are they talking about their weapons and about wars and so on? And I really began to discover, I think, something pretty significant that should be a part of our political work that really isn't very central today. And then to sort of put it within a real political framework, I put it within the context of transnational capital. In other words, I want to, look, I'm almost 70 years old. I don't have time for little tiny causes anymore. Incremental things, and let's, you know, I want to jump, as we said in Oslo, to the final status issues. So I want to go to the big picture. And the system, the world system that we live in, which is probably too abstract and too big for most of us to even deal with, is the capitalist, today neoliberal, very aggressive capitalist system. That's what we live in. That's what determines the way we dress, the way we think, our politics, and everything. And so you can't disconnect the occupation and Israel and selling arms and security and the way the world is working and the global economy from this larger world system. So I tried to put this all within this kind of a framework. And I'm not going to get into too much. I don't have so much time. But this is something that's kind of interesting. You know, if you look at just for a minute to put out the bigger global context of transnational capital as the world system that we live in, you know, capitalism runs, as a world system does, through hegemony. Not so much anymore through conquest. In other words, the military's there. It's kind of a velvet glove. But the whole idea is to sell it to us, that we want it, that we're a part of it, that we identify with it, that we don't see it. I mean, we really don't see it. We don't walk around talking about transnational capital. Even the language is kind of, as I was writing this, I kind of felt, you know, I'm back in the 50s. You know, with old language that is almost funny today in a way. And that's the success of the system, is to completely deflect our attention from its very existence. So that, but transnational capital enforces its hegemony, nevertheless, in different ways. And that's what I was trying to look at in my book. And just to be really quick about it, there's three, I think, major elements in the enforcement of hegemony, in the global system. One is, of course, military operations. So you have a $2.5 trillion a year industry. I mean, you've got some big hardware out there, and technologies, and power, and that exists. But in fact, war today is not what we usually think of as war. Interstate warfare, conventional warfare, where you use, if not nuclear weapon missiles, you use missiles, you use navies, you use air forces, and so on, against other states, armies against armies, that's pretty much gone today. The last real major interstate conflict, I would say, was Korea. You know, you've had a few smaller ones over the years. Iraq-Iran in the 80s, the 73 war, Egypt, Israel, Syria, the British invasion of the Falkland Islands, that was a great little war. Maybe Russia in the Ukraine. The Americans did attack Iraq, and Iraq was formerly at least a state. But those kinds of wars were very sporadic and very episodic and localized in a sense. So there's a British general named Rupert Smith, who's supposed to be the most intellectual British general, which is kind of a contradiction in terms. But who's also married to an Israeli woman, which is kind of, I don't know where that fits into the story, but it's in his book. Who writes in his book that's called The Utility of Force, that the new paradigm of warfare today is what he calls war amongst the people. War amongst the people. Urban warfare. That cities used to always be avoided by armies. You besieged a city, you bombed a city, but you didn't go into a city. But today, the vast majority, or the majority of human beings, live in cities. So you can't fight against people, and wars today are mainly against non-state actors. And resistance movements, especially movements that in a sense resist capitalism and the capitalist system in one way or another, or resist the hegemons in one way or another, and are demonized as terrorists and rogue states and all the language we use for them. But war today is more war amongst the people. I changed it in my book to what it really is, which is war against the people. And that's the form of warfare, and it gets down into what's called securitization. In other words, today you don't really have a distinction between the military, security, and policing. They all become one kind of a system in a sense. And all right, I'll come back to that in a second. But another important part of war, and this whole, the capitalist system is not only dominant, obviously. It doesn't only run our lives, but it's a very violent system. Capitalism is based on inequality, exploitation. Now we have the saying in our heads, the 1%, 99%. In fact, the 1% is much less than 1% that really run things. And it has built within it violence of all kinds of ways. And in fact, most of humanity, probably 2/3 of humanity, is considered by the corporations and those that rule the system as surplus humanity. The people of the global south, including people of the global south that are in pockets of the global north, will never be consumers. That's the greatest sin of all. Will never be educated, will never be productive, and in that sense are written off. So it's a system that has to enforce by hegemony, if it can, seemingly to not be too directly oppressive to people, but at the same time, what it has to be able to have those kinds of warfare. But the third part of it is the way the system actually kind of works. And that is through framing, what I call framing, which is the way it's sold, the PR, the way it's sold to people in entertainment, in schools, in churches, in the media, and so on, so that we internalize capitalism. We don't even talk about it. I mean, when was the last time you used the word capitalism? I mean, I probably in some class, you know, when you were 14 or something. I mean, it's just not a word we use. And when we use it, it's kind of, everybody sort of smirks because it sounds like you're some old whatever, which I am. So, but framing is very important because that's how we internalize. And one of the interesting dynamics, I think, is that when we think about capitalism, we think about colonialism, we think about the days of an expanding capitalism and so on, monopoly capitalism, the days of Teddy Roosevelt, when you walk softly and carried a big stick, and so on. And in the early days, and actually capitalism probably up through World War II, until after World War II, was a kind of a capitalism that we're more familiar with. That was based on military operations mainly, the conquest of lands and peoples, because capitalism was still in the stage of expanding. Even when you had the Soviet Union and Red China, it was expanding, and of course with the end of the Cold War, it completely took over the international system. And when it conquered, these were colonial wars for the most part, the war amongst the people, securitization kicked in. And it was largely policing, and the whole process in what we call today the Global South, kind of imposing an economic market, determinism, way of thinking, way of living on people. And in fact, the framing was less important because everybody lived their lives in the capitalist countries and didn't really care very much about colonialism. But, it was sort of like we're civilizing, our brown brothers, as was often said, or we're fighting wars against enemies because we demonized the colonized people as enemies, just like Israel does today with the Palestinians. And that was a dynamic, going military-based and going towards kind of a weak framing. But today, where we're in an advanced capitalism, that's really won. It's really pacifying us. The whole dynamic goes the other direction. And that is, the framing becomes crucial. And that's where we get the ideas of security. I mean, look at today. I mean, Brussels last week was like, it was worse than Jerusalem. And here as well, you began to see the military in the streets, this whole idea of security. I went to an airport today that was crazy. And the use of the idea of wars on terrorism, wars on drugs, these are open-ended. Wars in the old sense of a conventional war had a purpose and a timeline and an enemy. And the whole idea of war was you won. And there was a decisive outcome, and there was a victory, you won, and you went home and did whatever with the conquered peoples you wanted to do. That was the concept of war. Today it's open-ended. The war on terror is an open-ended thing. It can justify anything. And of course, one of the keys to it, and you have that in France today, is declaring a state of emergency. Then once you declare a state of emergency, that becomes a permanent reality. That's not a transitory sort of thing. The United States has been in a state of emergency since 9/11. If you go into Kennedy Airport, they even have a thermometer that shows you how high the alert is, and it's almost always on red. But that's the whole idea, is that war has become, and security has become the main way in which capitalism enforces its hegemony among us. And then, when it needs to, it kicks in with securitization and pacification. You see that in Europe over the last couple of weeks. And then, of course, when it needs to, in other countries, it can always call on military operations. But the military operations are really secondary. They're a disciplining, police kind of an action. They're not an action of conquering. That's why the wars are open-ended. So, all right, so what? How does Israel, how does this all fit in? Well, what's interesting is the way you measure the power of a country today is by its conventional military strength. How many missiles does it have? How many nuclear weapons does it have? How many jet airplanes does it have, and what kind? Naval vehicles, tanks. I mean, those are the measures. You have Jane's Defense Weekly that ranks countries by their military strength. Military strength. And that has a lot to do with a country's self-perception, how important it's taken in the international community. But in fact, like I said, what's interesting is the conventional interstate wars that these weapons are intended for are gone. Here you got Britain today investing 11 billion pounds in the Trident nuclear missile system, where the British Ministry of Defense says we don't need it. There's nobody to use it on. But that's how you measure a country's political clout and power. So what's happened then is, instead of conventional interstate wars, again, we're moving towards wars amongst the people, wars against the people, and there's two kinds of wars in particular. One is what the military calls hybrid wars. We often use the word asymmetrical conflicts. In other words, when states are fighting non-state actors, like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, Israel with Hezbollah in 2006, or Hamas in Gaza, even fighting against drug cartels. I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of wars against non-state actors. They're hybrid wars in the sense that they're not just a few guerrillas with some Kalashnikovs hiding in a cave. But these are non-state actors that have access to very powerful military technologies. And, Israel didn't do too well against Hezbollah in 2006. So it's asymmetrical in a way, but if you see what's happening today in Syria and Afghanistan and other places, I'm not sure if it's in what direction it's asymmetrical, sort of. I mean, so at any rate, wars against the people abroad are those kinds, and look at all the different kinds of things we talk about. Irregular wars, guerrilla wars, low-intensity conflicts, we say all the time. There's all kinds of, and down to policing operations, peacekeeping operations, and so on. The other form of war that you have today is in our societies, inside. And that's what I call securocratic wars. These are wars of disciplining. Disciplining us, disciplining migrants, refugees, poor people, peoples of color, even the elite students themselves. In the UK today there's a program that's called Prevent in the UK universities, where if you hear in the class, whether you're a student or a teacher, if you hear anyone in a classroom discussion voicing an opinion that could conceivably be construed as leading to an extremist point of view, your legal obligation is to report that person to the authorities. I mean, this is targeting the elite students of universities. So the whole securitization has a paranoia built into it. No, you're never safe. The enemies are within, and so on. And so you get things like the war on idea. Of course, counterterrorism. Can't allow refugees in because there's sleepers among the refugees, right, that are really ISIS. Homeland security, state of emergency, down into policing. So that's kind of in a very broad way, a kind of a map of conflict today. And what's interesting to me is that, the Israeli, Israel can't produce nuclear submarines. I mean, it's a small country. F-35s and things like that. So the strategy, and this is a term that's used by the Israeli Ministry of Defense, is niche filling. We look around at the different hegemons that exist in the world, whether it's the big powers of the global north or the second-tier powers of the BRICS countries or the global south, elites and warlords or whatever, and we fill the niches of their needs in terms of security and war and policing. So in some ways, if you look at the map of conflict today, this hybrid wars, the securocratic wars, are the niche that Israel has carved out. I'm not saying Israel is the only actor, of course, in this, but you know, where the NATO and Europe and the United States and the big militaries, including Russia and China to a large degree, are concentrated still on arsenals that are relevant to conventional interstate wars, when you're really fighting a war in Afghanistan against Al-Qaeda, whatever, you go to Israel for the hardware, for the tactics, for the weapon systems, the surveillance systems, the security systems, because Israel is the one that specializes in these two, what have become really the cutting edge of war. And the United States and NATO never wanted to deal with that. These are unsexy wars, police actions. You know, you don't need F-35s to fight them, or nuclear. And so, you know, a country's strength is not measured by how many police cars it has. You see? And so what's happened is these huge arsenals of the different countries are irrelevant to the types of wars that are being fought. And here Israel has, in a sense, this edge in terms of this kind of warfare. I'll give you one little example. Drones. Drones are a huge thing today. 40% of the world's drones are Israeli. And the technology is Israeli. Now you're developing the Watchkeeper drone, which is going to be Europe's drone. Thales is developing it with Elbit.